From childhood, I shared everything with my brother, our toys, our bread, even our silence. But one day, he reached into my pocket and took the coin our father had given me. That's when I understood. For him, value always outweighed blood. Decades passed. My hair turned gray, and my son grew up and brought a wife into our home. I rejoiced in the new family, until I saw a familiar gleam in my brother's eyes. Grown thieves rarely change their habits. Only the price of what they steal becomes much higher. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Richard Caldwell. I was 72 years old and had spent my entire life in the same town in western Pennsylvania. The kind of place where everyone knew what time you mowed your lawn. I was a carpenter by trade, and not the kind that installs cabinets in prefab homes for a quick buck. I worked with raw timber, built things from nothing. Houses, porches, staircases, even coffins once or twice. Though I never liked that part. My hands bore the history of every board I'd ever shaped. My palms were like a map of grain and splinters and dust. And even after I retired, I never stopped sanding the edges of things. The house I lived in was the second one I built with my own hands. The first had burned down in '83, faulty wiring, they said. But I never blamed the wires. I blamed my own exhaustion. I'd come home late every night, too tired to notice the subtle hum behind the walls. I took that as a lesson. Don't forget your own work. This second house, the one I retired in, sat at the end of a quiet road just outside New Brighton. It wasn't fancy. A simple single story with cedar siding and wide windows that let in the morning sun. The back deck sagged a little, but it had soul. Everything in that house carried the scent of wood, even the fabric of the old recliner I sat in each evening. The kitchen had hand-carved cabinets I built in the mid-90s, and I could still see the small chisel mistake I made on the third drawer from the left. I'd kept it. I wanted it there. A reminder that imperfection is part of building something lasting. The floor creaked in places that only I could anticipate. The walls held marks where furniture had been moved too hastily in younger years. The pantry door was a little warped from humidity, and I never fixed it, because I liked how it resisted me slightly each morning, as if the house still had a will of its own. I didn't keep much clutter. There were a few framed photographs. My wife Helen in her nursing uniform, standing next to a patient who'd clearly been mid-laugh. My son John on the day he graduated from the fire academy, stiff as a plank in his formal uniform, trying to look brave. And then there was one photo I never displayed. It stayed in the drawer of my workbench in the garage, me and my brother Michael, standing in front of our childhood home, holding hands and squinting into the sun. I kept it not for nostalgia, but for proof that once, even for a moment, there had been something like trust. I'd lived alone since Helen passed 23 years ago. She died in late spring, when the daffodils were just opening, and I remember how quiet the world got after the funeral. I never remarried. I couldn't see the point. The house was filled with echoes of her. Her teacups lined on the shelf, the wool blanket she knit for our anniversary draped over the couch, her perfume bottle still on the dresser, though it had long since dried out. I didn't need a new life. I only needed to not forget the one I had. The neighborhood changed over time. The Martins across the street moved to Florida. The O'Connells got divorced and sold their place to a young couple who threw parties every Memorial Day weekend. Kids rode their bikes past my driveway and never waved. Dogs barked at unfamiliar cars, and no one left their doors unlocked anymore. But my house remained the same. I swept the porch every Saturday. I polished the banister even though no one used the stairs but me. I oiled the hinges on the screen door to keep the squeal away. The garage smelled like sawdust and motor oil. My tools hung in precise alignment on the wall, their outlines drawn in Sharpie behind them, so I'd know if anything went missing. I hadn't used most of them in years, but I kept them clean. The habit of order was something I could never shake. There was comfort in it. Even when my knees ached and the arthritis in my fingers made it hard to grasp a screwdriver, I still went out there once a week to wipe everything down. I didn't have many visitors. John came by on holidays, sometimes brought his wife, Susan, who always looked mildly uncomfortable among the older furniture and smell of pine wax. She didn't understand why I never updated the appliances or replaced the curtains, but I didn't need stainless steel or blackout drapes. I needed familiarity, continuity. This house was my spine. Without it, I wouldn't know how to stand. I spent most days reading the newspaper, listening to classical music on the radio, or walking the perimeter of the yard, checking for loose shingles or rot. The garden was modest, just a few rose bushes and a patch of thyme, but I tended it carefully. Every evening, I sat on the back steps and listened to the birds. Sometimes, when the wind came down from the hills, I could smell the sawmill that had long since closed. It made me feel like I was still part of something working, something larger than just breath and bones. People think solitude is sad. They confuse silence with emptiness. But I never felt lonely in that house. I felt anchored. Each creak in the floor was a conversation. Each stain on the counter was a memory. My life wasn't exciting, but it was mine, and I had carved it from the grain of time like a beam for a roof. Still, some memories clung like mildew behind wallpaper. Some rooms stayed locked not with keys, but with caution. And one of those memories, one I had buried under decades of quiet labor, had begun to scratch its way out. I didn't know it yet, but it would come not in the form of a whisper or a ghost, but in flesh. In a knock on the door, in a voice I hadn't heard in 40 years. The house, for all its strength, would tremble again, and this time, it wouldn't be fire or wind that tested its walls. It would be family, and history, and the question of what we ever really own when blood can reach into your home and pull it apart from the inside. When I was 7 years old, my father gave me a coin. Not just any coin, but a 1922 silver dollar. It was thick and heavy in my hand, with the worn face of Lady Liberty on one side and an eagle on the other, wings spread like it was ready to lift off the surface. My father didn't say much when he handed it to me. He never said much at all, but I remember his hand was warm, his palm calloused, and his eyes tired. He just placed it in my small fingers and nodded once, like I was supposed to understand something that wasn't being said out loud. I didn't ask why he gave it to me. I didn't need to. It was one of those moments that felt like a ceremony, quiet and sacred. I slipped the coin into the front pocket of my overalls and didn't let it leave my side for weeks. I held it between my fingers when I lay in bed at night, tracing the edge over and over like a prayer. It became a kind of protection, something that reminded me that I was seen, that my father, silent, hard-working, distant, had given me a piece of something that mattered. Back then, we lived in a narrow house near the railroad tracks. You could hear the rumble of the freight cars at night, feel the windows shake just enough to make the walls whisper. We didn't have much. My mother cooked from scratch and sewed our clothes. My father worked at the mill and came home covered in dust. He'd sit on the back steps and smoke until the sun dipped below the tree line. There were no hugs, no I love yous, no bedtime stories. But that coin was his version of all of it. My brother Michael was 2 years older than me. He had sharp eyes and quick hands. He was the kind of boy who could charm a teacher and steal her lunch in the same hour. I idolized him in that helpless little brother way that kids do, even when he shoved me or called me names. He was bold, where I was cautious, reckless where I was obedient, and he was always watching, especially when something wasn't his. The day the coin disappeared, I still remember every detail. I had hidden it in the drawer of my nightstand, wrapped in a piece of cloth from one of my mother's old aprons. It was a Saturday, and the rain had kept us indoors. Michael and I had spent the afternoon building forts out of couch cushions, pretending the floor was lava. When I went to check on the coin later that evening, the drawer was slightly open. The cloth was there. The coin was gone. I didn't panic at first. I searched the floor, the cushions under the bed. I asked my mother if she had moved anything while cleaning. She shook her head, without looking up from her sewing. My stomach started to twist. I knew Michael had been in my room. I remembered the way he looked when I told him a few days earlier that the coin was real silver, and how his eyes had narrowed just a little too long. When I confronted him, he shrugged, said he hadn't touched anything, said I must have lost it. And then he turned and walked away before I could say anything else, already whistling like it meant nothing. But I knew. I knew the way you know when someone's taken more than just an object. I'd seen it in his face, the way he smiled to himself when he thought no one was watching. I didn't tell our parents. I wasn't sure they would believe me. Even then, I understood the politics of silence in our house. Tattling was weakness. Complaining was shameful. I kept my mouth shut and let the loss harden into something small and sharp inside me. The next day, I saw Michael flipping a coin behind the woodshed. He was tossing it in the air and catching it, over and over, like it was just a toy. I stood there in the doorway, watching him. I could see the familiar flash of silver in the light, could recognize the weight of it by the way it moved. He caught me looking and froze. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he slipped the coin into his pocket and grinned. That grin stayed with me for years. I tried to forget about the coin after that. I tried to pretend it had never existed. But it had been more than just money. It had been a kind of bond, a silent message between a father and son. And now it was gone, and in its place was the beginning of something else, something colder. I began to understand that trust could be taken, just like a coin, that some people feel entitled to whatever they can reach, and that family doesn't always mean loyalty. I carried that lesson with me into adulthood. I didn't hold grudges, not in the way that burns, but I kept memories. I kept them like nails in a box under the workbench, waiting for the day they might be needed. Years passed, and I grew into a man who measured twice and cut once, who worked with quiet pride and stayed out of trouble. But part of me still felt the absence of that coin, not because of the metal, not because of its worth, but because it had been mine, because it had been taken. Michael never gave it back, never mentioned it again, and I never asked. Instead, I let that moment sit like a cornerstone at the foundation of who I became. I built myself around it, quiet, careful, observant, a man who gave but didn't forget. Because in every creak of wood and every joint I hammered, I remembered. In every cabinet I measured, I remembered. And when the years had passed, and the walls of my life stood tall and weathered, I still felt that absence in my pocket. The coin had been the first thing he stole. It wouldn't be the last. I never imagined that the quiet would be so loud. People talk about retirement like it's a soft landing, a well-earned rest at the end of a life of labor. But no one tells you how hollow it feels when the rhythm of your days suddenly stops, when the early morning alarm disappears, when the coffee no longer marks the start of a job site, but simply fills an empty kitchen. When the sawdust settles and the tools hang untouched, the silence doesn't comfort, it accuses. I retired at 68. I had planned it out, penciled the numbers, counted the hours I'd earned. I told myself it was time. My back had started giving me trouble, and my knees ached every morning like they had their own weather forecast. I thought I'd use the time to read more, maybe fix up the attic, go fishing now and then. But the first week turned into the first month, and before I knew it, I'd gone days without speaking a word out loud. The house began to feel bigger. The corners seemed deeper, the shadows longer. I noticed things I had ignored for decades: the ticking of the old kitchen clock, the uneven breath of the refrigerator, the faint whistle of the wind sneaking through the window frames. At night, The creaks in the floorboards became conversations I didn't want to have. I filled my time with routine. Wake at 6, shower, make coffee, read the local paper front to back, even the classifieds, wash the dishes, though there were barely any, sweep the porch, walk the perimeter of the yard, check the mailbox. Most days, it was empty, and the sound of its metal flap clanging shut felt like an echo of something I couldn't name. Sometimes I stood at the window and watched the neighbors. The Parkers had a dog that barked at everything. The Millers' teenage daughter had dyed her hair pink and came home too late. The world outside kept spinning, loud and fast, while mine moved slower than molasses. I got used to eating alone. Toast in the morning, soup at noon, maybe something from the freezer for dinner. I kept everything simple, practical. No one was coming over, so there was no need for a tablecloth or a second plate. The dining room that once held birthday cakes and Christmas roasts now held a layer of dust on the china cabinet and an untouched chair across from mine. The phone rarely rang. When it did, it was either a robocall or a medical office reminding me of an appointment. John called occasionally. He had his own life, his own worries. I never wanted to be a burden, so I let him believe I was fine. And I was, in the way an old fence post is fine. Still upright, still holding, but weathered and alone. Sometimes I tried to write letters, but I never knew what to say. The words felt too heavy, or too empty. I started a journal once, thinking it might help me process the days, but every page sounded the same. Woke up, took pills, cleaned the gutters. After a week, I closed it and never opened it again. I started talking to the house. Not in any crazy way, not like I expected it to answer, just small things. A word of thanks to the stove when it heated evenly, a mutter to the lamp when the bulb flickered, a sigh to the hallway as I passed through it for the 100th time that day. I told myself it was just habit, not loneliness. Some mornings I sat in my recliner and stared at the wall for so long that the light shifted across it, like time trying to show itself. I thought about Helen often, how she used to hum while she folded laundry, how her laugh sounded when she told a joke she thought was clever. I thought about her hands, always busy, always warm, the way she would press them into mine when we watched TV, as if reminding me she was there, even when nothing needed to be said. Without her, the house was quieter. It smelled like cedar and old paper instead of vanilla and clean laundry. Her side of the bed stayed made. Her robe still hung on the hook behind the bathroom door. I couldn't bring myself to move it. I watched the seasons change through the same windows I had installed 30 years before. Fall came, and the leaves turned to fire. Winter pressed frost against the glass. Spring crept in with muddy boots, and summer brought bees that hovered too long near the screens. Every season reminded me that I was still here, even if no one else noticed. One evening, I sat outside on the back steps and watched the sun sink behind the trees. The sky turned that strange, quiet purple that only comes in early autumn. I realized I couldn't remember the last time someone said my name. Really said it. Not a nurse reading a chart or a clerk checking my ID, but someone who meant it. There was a certain erosion that came with age, not of the body, but of the self. It was like I was still standing, but little pieces had been chipping away over the years. A forgotten birthday, a missed invitation, a visit cut short. And each time, something smaller inside me disappeared. Still, I kept going. Not because I had somewhere to be, but because I didn't know how to stop. I was a man built to endure, to keep working even after the job was done. I had been shaped by years of nails and boards and schedules, and retirement hadn't changed that. It had just taken away the structure. And so I made one of my own, even if no one saw it, even if no one ever came to admire the frame, even if I was the last one left in the room. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, right as I was sitting down with a cup of lukewarm coffee and a crossword puzzle I'd already half finished the day before. I remember the way the phone rang. 3 times, too quickly, as if the voice on the other end couldn't wait to spill out. It was John, my son, and he told me he'd gotten married. Just like that. No engagement announcement, no ceremony invite, no warning. Married. He sounded happy. That was the first thing I noticed. There was a lightness in his voice that hadn't been there in a long time, maybe since his early 20s before the grind of adult life took hold of him. He said her name was Susan, that they met through work, that it all happened quickly, but it felt right. I said all the things a father is supposed to say. Congratulations, I'm happy for you. I can't wait to meet her. But when I hung up, I just sat there staring at the crossword, the pen still resting between my fingers, my coffee cooling fast. I didn't know how to feel. Pride? Disappointment? I'd always imagined I'd be there for that day, that moment when my son crossed that invisible threshold from one life to another. I thought I'd shake his hand in the church lobby, nod at him from across the aisle, maybe give a short toast, even if my voice trembled. But instead, I got a phone call after it was all over, like being told a storm had passed through town, but you never heard the thunder. A week later, they came to visit. I stood on the porch when they pulled up in a silver sedan I didn't recognize. John got out first. He looked tired, but proud, like someone carrying something valuable he didn't quite know how to hold. Then she stepped out. Susan. She was taller than I expected, with a confident gait and a sharpness to her that didn't soften even as she smiled. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her coat was the kind you see on women who shop in places I've never stepped foot in. She walked up the steps without hesitation, extended her hand like she was greeting a client, and told me how nice it was to finally meet. She called me Mr. Caldwell. I told her Richard was fine. She laughed politely and said she'd try to remember. John stood behind her, nodding, his hands in his pockets, glancing around the porch like he hadn't seen it in years. Maybe he hadn't. They stayed for an hour. Susan talked more than John did. She asked questions about the house, about the woodwork, about how long I'd lived there. She complimented the craftsmanship, said it felt authentic. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a euphemism for old. I watched the way she moved through the rooms, her eyes sharp and assessing, like she was measuring more than just space. John sat on the edge of the couch, responding when prompted, but mostly silent. When they left, she hugged me. Not tightly, not with affection, just enough contact to check the box of warmth. John patted my back, told me they'd be in touch, and then they were gone. I stood in the doorway long after their car had disappeared down the road, trying to remember what Susan's perfume smelled like. It reminded me of something synthetic and expensive, a department store, or a hotel. Over the next few months, they came by now and then, not often, just enough to say they were present. I began to notice how John deferred to her, how she answered questions for him, how he looked at her before he spoke. I wasn't judging. I'd seen that kind of thing before. But there was something in her that made me uneasy, though I couldn't have named it then. Not rudeness, not malice, just a certain calculation, like she was always doing mental math, weighing things, assigning value. Susan began to make small suggestions, harmless things at first, that maybe I could repaint the kitchen, modernize the appliances, install better lighting. She said it with a smile, her tone light, but I felt the undertone, the way a realtor suggests staging a house without saying it directly. I laughed it off, told her I liked things the way they were. She smiled again, but didn't laugh. John, for his part, was distant. Not cold, but distant, like he was trying to straddle 2 worlds and wasn't sure where his weight should fall. He asked fewer questions, gave shorter answers, and when we were alone, which wasn't often, he never brought up the past, never asked about his mother or my work or the stories I used to tell him when he was small. He looked like a man trying to keep pace with a train he had already boarded, unsure of the destination, but afraid to get off. They invited me to dinner once. Their apartment was across town, a high-rise near the business district. The building had elevators that whispered, and a doorman who looked through me. Inside, everything was clean and cold. Glass tables, white walls, furniture that looked better than it felt. Susan served wine I couldn't pronounce, and food that tasted like it had been designed by a machine. I tried to compliment it, but the words felt misplaced. After dinner, Susan asked if I had ever thought about downsizing, said it might be easier, more practical. I smiled and said I liked the space, that the house had air and memory. She nodded, but her eyes said something else. When I left that night, I walked the block before calling a cab. I needed the air. The city lights made the pavement look wet, though it hadn't rained. I passed store windows filled with things I didn't need and watched people rushing by like they were chasing ghosts. I felt out of place, not just in the city, in time. Back home, I sat in my recliner and stared at the ceiling for a long while. The house groaned as it settled. The floorboards creaked like old knees. And I realized then, maybe for the first time, that I was no longer the center of my son's orbit, that he had a new family now, a new voice guiding him, one that spoke with authority and elegance and unspoken expectations. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. But something in me shifted, a quiet acceptance, the kind that builds like snow in a corner of the roof, weightless at first, until one day it falls and startles the whole house. The silence that followed their visit wasn't different from the one before, but it felt heavier. It felt earned. I hadn't seen my brother Michael in over 30 years when he showed up at my door. The last time we stood face to face, we were both much younger men, still clinging to the last shreds of civility our parents had stitched between us. He had a different life then, different wife, different state, different story. He left town shortly after our father died and never looked back. Not even a phone call, not a letter, just gone. I didn't expect to hear from him again. Some people vanish so cleanly, you start to think they were only ever imagined. It was late afternoon when the knock came. I had just finished pruning the hedges out front and was wiping my hands with an old towel when I heard it. 3 sharp raps, not tentative, not shy, certain. I opened the door and there he stood. He looked older than I remembered, his hair fully gray, his frame thinner, his face deeply lined. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, just like they were when we were boys and he used to swipe cookies before dinner, then let me take the blame. He said my name like it was a test, like he wasn't sure if I was still the same man he left behind. I didn't answer. I just stepped aside and let him in. My silence was deliberate. It was the only currency I had with him that still held any value. Michael walked into the house like he'd never left. He glanced around, nodding to himself, studying the furniture, the photographs, the woodwork. He complimented the place, said it smelled like cedar and memory. I didn't respond. I watched the way his eyes moved, the way they lingered on the little things, my father's tools still hanging in the hallway, the worn edges of the banister, the old clock on the mantel. He wasn't admiring them. He was calculating them, taking inventory. He said he was back in town for a while, that he was between jobs, that life had pulled him back to Pennsylvania and he thought it was time to reconnect. His words were smooth, practiced, polished like river stones. But I'd lived too long, seen too much to fall for that voice. The one that always came before the ask. Michael never came without needing something. I offered him coffee out of habit, not hospitality. He accepted with a smile that stretched too wide and said he missed my coffee. I knew that was a lie. He never cared for it, always said it was too bitter. But that was Michael. He'd pretend to like something if it meant gaining ground. He asked about John, said he remembered him as a kid, running around with skinned knees and a baseball glove too big for his hand. He laughed like he was fond of the memory, but there was something off in the way he said it, like he wasn't remembering a boy, but picturing a man he could now talk to as an equal. Or something else. I kept the conversation brief. I asked him where he was staying, and he said he didn't know yet, that he was figuring it out. He looked at me when he said that, just long enough to let the implications sink in. I didn't offer him a room. I didn't ask if he needed help. I just nodded and stood. After he left, I sat on the porch and listened to the wind move through the trees. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was watchful, like the house itself knew something was shifting. The next week, he came back. He brought a bottle of wine and said he thought we should catch up. I didn't drink much anymore, and he knew that. But he opened it anyway, poured 2 glasses, and made himself comfortable in the chair across from me, like he was entitled to the space. He talked about nothing for an hour. Weather, traffic, news. But every now and then, he'd drop in a detail. A question about the neighborhood, a comment about the size of the yard, a glance at the photo of Helen on the shelf. I watched him watching everything. It was like sitting across from a fox in your chicken coop, pretending to admire the view. Michael never changed. He just got better at hiding it. He asked again about John, more pointed this time, where he lived, what he did, if he had a family. I gave short answers, enough to be polite, not enough to open doors. He didn't push. He just nodded like he was building a file in his mind. Over the next few weeks, his visits became routine. He never came empty-handed. A box of pastries, a bottle of bourbon. Once a book on woodworking, he said, made him think of me. He sat in the same chair, told stories from our childhood that he polished until they shone, even if they were half true or not true at all. He talked like he was rebuilding something, like the foundation was still there, just waiting for a little care. But I remembered the cracks. I remembered the coin. I remembered how, when our mother died, he had taken the family savings without a word, how he disappeared with no forwarding address, how he left me to clean up after the funeral, to deal with the debts, to explain to the lawyers why one brother was unreachable. I remembered all of it, and I didn't say a word. One morning, I found him in the backyard. He said he had come by early and let himself in through the side gate. He was standing near the tool shed, looking at the old oak tree where John used to hang a tire swing. He asked how long the tree had been there. I said I didn't know. He asked if the shed still locked. I said it did. He smiled and said something about how things last when they're built right. I nodded, but my stomach turned. Something about the way he lingered near the edge of the yard, the way he ran his hand along the fence like he was measuring it, the way he looked at the house, not like a visitor, but like a scout. That was when I knew for certain Michael hadn't come back for me. He hadn't come back for memory or redemption or to make amends. He had come back because he smelled something valuable. And this time, I wasn't the only thing he had his eyes on. The living room in my house had always been a quiet place. It wasn't meant for guests or gatherings, not anymore. It was where I kept my recliner, my books, my radio tuned to the local station that played nothing but jazz and static. The walls were painted the same soft eggshell I'd chosen 2 decades earlier. The carpet bore the subtle impression of furniture that hadn't moved in years. I knew every mark, every dent, every pattern of sunlight that fell across the floor at different hours of the day. The room was familiar, predictable, steady. Or it had been, before the shadows started shifting. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Michael had started coming by more frequently, and Susan had taken to stopping in as well, always under the pretense of dropping something off or checking in on how I was doing. She brought muffins once, from a bakery across town she said I'd love. I didn't love them. They were too sweet, and the texture was wrong. But I smiled, thanked her, and placed them on the counter like a prop in a play I hadn't agreed to perform in. They began to overlap. Michael would show up, then Susan, and it didn't take long before I noticed they arrived with increasing coordination. She'd pull into the driveway not long after he was already seated in the living room, chatting idly about weather, taxes, or something he read in the paper. The coincidence became pattern, and with that pattern came something else. Something slower, more insidious. I started watching them, not openly, but in the way old men learn to watch the world. Quietly, deliberately. I stayed in the kitchen a little longer when they thought I'd gone to my room. I stepped a little softer down the hallway when they were sitting on the couch. I stood just behind the edge of the doorway, where I could see the corner of the armrest and the shape of their silhouettes reflected in the window glass. There were long pauses in their conversations when I wasn't in the room, unspoken stretches that didn't resume when I returned. The air felt different when I walked in, heavier, like dust unsettled by motion. One afternoon, I came back from the shed and found them seated closely on the couch, not quite touching, but angled toward one another in a way that didn't look casual. Susan was laughing, but not loudly. A breathy kind of laugh, like she had just finished saying something not meant to be shared. They stood quickly when they saw me, and something about the timing made my stomach pull. Michael asked about an old photograph on the shelf, as if trying to redirect the moment. Susan adjusted her coat, even though it wasn't cold. I answered his question and said nothing else. That night, I sat in the dark of the living room after they had gone. I didn't turn on the lamp. I just sat in my recliner and let the shadows return to their natural state. The air in the room still held the faint scent of her perfume, floral, expensive, misplaced in this old house. I stared at the spot on the couch where she had been sitting, and remembered how close his hand had been to hers. The next time they came by, I pretended to be asleep. I left the bedroom door slightly ajar and lay still on the bed. I heard the front door open, heard Michael's voice carry softly down the hallway. I heard Susan's laugh again, quieter than before. They didn't knock on my door. They didn't call my name. I heard the creak of the floorboards near the living room, then the subtle shift of weight as the couch springs compressed. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The silence between them said more than speech could. It was the kind of silence people share when they think they're alone, the kind that hums with familiarity, with intention. Something inside me turned cold, not from betrayal, not yet, but from recognition. I had seen this pattern before. In high school, when a friend had started dating the girl I liked. In my early marriage, when Helen had grown quiet around a neighbor who complimented her a little too often. In the workplace, when younger men had slowly nudged out older ones with smiles and backhanded kindness. The posture, the tone, the rhythm. It was always the same. And now, it lived in my house. I began to take note of the subtle changes. The way Susan referred to Michael as your brother, less, and just said Michael more. The way she leaned toward him during conversations, her body angled as if shielding something. The way Michael spoke for her, answered questions she wasn't asked, as though they'd rehearsed a shared script. They started using the living room as their meeting place, not mine. They sat side by side, close enough that the fabric of their clothing must have brushed. I watched from the hallway mirror, its angle just wide enough to catch a sliver of the scene. I saw their reflections, but not their expressions. That made it worse. It forced my mind to fill in the blanks. One afternoon, I left a book open on the armrest of the recliner to see if they would move it. When I returned, the book was gone, placed neatly on the side table. My blanket had been folded too, in a way I never did it. Not Helen's fold, not mine. A stranger's hand had touched my things, rearranged my quiet. I tested it again the next week. I placed a coaster upside down, just off-center, near the lamp. When I came back, It was right side up, perfectly aligned with the base. They thought they were subtle, but this house had lived with me for too long to lie. It noticed. It remembered. They stayed longer with each visit. Sometimes Susan would come without John. Sometimes Michael came first, and she arrived later, saying she just happened to be in the area. I didn't question them. I didn't confront them. I just sat back and let the shadows do the talking. They grew thicker in the living room each week, creeping along the carpet, sliding up the walls, swallowing the light. It was no longer my space. It had become something else, a place of murmurs, of glances, of things left unsaid, but fully understood. I kept my silence, but I began to plan, not out of revenge, out of self-preservation. Because when shadows take root in a house, they don't leave on their own. They have to be shown the door. I became something else in my own house. Not a host, not a father, not even an old man trying to hold on to the shape of his life. I became a presence, a shadow, a figure who moved soundlessly from room to room, watching without blinking, listening without judgment. I became what the walls already knew, something quiet that saw everything. It didn't start as a plan. At first it was just habit, waking up before dawn, stepping softly across the cold wooden floor to make coffee before the birds began to stir. But soon, I found myself doing more than just sipping from my mug. I began walking the house with a different posture, like a man treading across a frozen lake, careful not to break the surface. I stopped turning on lights when I moved through the hallways. I learned the creaks in the floor again, the places to avoid if I didn't want to be heard. I stopped making noise. That's when the house began to talk. The days became long stretches of performance. I played the part they expected. I answered questions with short, measured replies. I sat in my recliner when they were in the room and closed my eyes when they lingered too long on the couch. I let them believe I was drifting in and out of sleep, old and harmless, too fogged by age to see what bloomed in front of me. But at night, I was wide awake. I began to keep notes, not on paper. I wasn't foolish. I used the margins of my mind, etched details into memory the same way I used to etch measurements into wood. The angle of Michael's body when he sat next to Susan, the way her eyes softened when he spoke, the shared smiles, the matching tones, the tension when John walked into the room, and the way it evaporated the moment he left. Sometimes they didn't even notice I was in the room. They spoke in fragments, words that dangled in the air like cobwebs. They never said anything that could be held, nothing that could be repeated and make a clean accusation. But it was all there, in their pacing, in their pauses, in the familiarity that belonged to people who'd crossed a line long ago. I remember the day I first noticed Susan sitting in my chair. It was a small thing. She didn't ask. She just settled into it like it belonged to her. Her arms draped over the sides, her legs crossed in a way that was too comfortable, too unthinking. When I walked in, she didn't move. She didn't apologize. She just smiled and said the sunlight hit the seat better in the morning. I said nothing, but my chest tightened in a way that surprised me. That was the last time I sat in that chair. I moved to the stool in the kitchen, the one Helen used to perch on when she was icing cookies or peeling apples for pie. It was hard on my back and didn't fit my frame, but it gave me a better angle of the living room. From there, I could see the side of Michael's face when he came by. I could watch Susan lean in close. I could measure the distance between them in inches, and those inches spoke more than any confession. I didn't tell John what I saw. How could I? What father wants to place that seed into the soil of his son's heart? What father wants to be the one who says, "Your life is not what you think it is"? Instead, I watched. I watched as Susan laughed a little too freely at Michael's jokes. I watched as she touched his arm when making a point. I watched as my brother looked at her, not like a guest in someone else's marriage, but like a man revisiting something he believed was already his. And I watched my son grow quieter. He never said anything to me, but his visits became shorter, his eyes more distant. He started arriving late, leaving early. The space between him and Susan lengthened, but not in the way of disconnection. It was resignation. Like he knew. Like he didn't know what to do with what he knew. I remembered something Helen once told me. She said that the cruelest part of betrayal wasn't the act itself. It was being made to feel crazy for seeing it. Being told that what you feel in your gut is paranoia, that what your eyes witness is coincidence. I never forgot that. And as I sat there, day after day, playing the fool in the corner, I understood her more than ever. There was a moment, just one, that told me everything. I had left a mug in the sink, intentionally, to rinse later. Susan and Michael were in the living room. I moved through the kitchen slowly, making no noise, and paused at the edge of the hallway where the shadows fell in just the right direction. I could see them reflected faintly in the glass of the framed picture above the fireplace. Michael was leaning in, his hand brushing Susan's knee. She didn't move away. I stood there for a long time, not breathing. And when I finally did exhale, it was slow and steady, like air escaping from something that had just been punctured. I didn't confront them. I didn't storm into the room or shout accusations. I simply turned and walked to the back of the house, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at my shoes. They were old, worn around the edges, the laces frayed, like me, still functional, still holding their shape, but not built for this kind of weight. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a pencil in my hand and a blank sheet of paper in front of me. I didn't write a letter. I didn't make a list. I just stared at the page and listened to the sounds of the house, the settling beams, the gentle knock of the wind against the siding, the occasional groan of the pipes. I realized I had become part of the house, one of its quiet sounds, a low hum in the background. But the house remembered. And so did I. What they didn't know, what they would never guess, is that I had already started preparing for what came next. My silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. It was preservation. It was the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had learned long ago that the loudest voice in the room is not the one that wins. It's the one that listens. And I had heard everything. I never believed in grand revenge. I wasn't the type to throw plates or shout across rooms. I didn't dream of dramatic exits or public scenes. That kind of thing belonged to younger men, the ones who hadn't yet learned that real power sits in stillness, that it's not noise that breaks trust, it's the quiet distance that follows. And so, I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I didn't write letters or make phone calls or demand explanations. I made coffee. I fed the birds. I opened the curtains just enough. And I planned. It began with the papers. In a wooden box under my bed, I kept every important document I'd ever signed. Property titles, insurance forms, deeds, my will. The house was paid off, of course. It had been for over a decade, and every inch of it was in my name. Not John's, not anyone else's, mine. That was something Michael never understood. While he spent his years chasing shortcuts and cutting corners, I had quietly built a fortress of paperwork and order. I knew where every key was, every receipt, every signature. The bureaucracy of my life was a map, and I was the only one who could read it. I took the papers out one night after they left. The house still smelled faintly of Susan's perfume, and I laid them across the kitchen table, lining them up like planks on a workbench. I reviewed everything, every clause, every name. I circled outdated contacts in red pen. I updated emergency information. I opened my laptop and began drafting letters to the institutions that mattered. My bank, my lawyer, the local tax office. I changed passcodes. I activated two-step verifications. I withdrew enough cash to carry in my pocket in case I needed to move quickly, though I had no plans to leave. I wasn't preparing for war. I was preparing for clarity. Susan had once asked, too casually, if I'd ever considered selling the house. She said it'd be easier for me, that a one-bedroom condo with an elevator might suit me better. I smiled, nodded, said I'd think about it. But I didn't forget. I never forgot when people mentioned money under the guise of concern. And Michael had that same look when he offered to help me get things in order a few weeks later, as if I were a collection of loose ends waiting to be tied up and handed over. So I began to close the doors. I called my lawyer and requested a private meeting. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't put it on the calendar. I took the bus across town and sat in a quiet office while we reviewed my will. I made amendments. I specified distributions. I added contingencies and removed assumptions. I made it so clear that even if someone tried to argue, the paper trail would outlast them. My signature, dated and witnessed, became my final word. I didn't cut John out. He was still my son. But I made sure that what I left behind could not be touched by Susan, or anyone who might stand next to her. I created a trust with strict stipulations. I assigned a third-party executor, someone with no blood ties, no family bias, someone I could trust not to be charmed or swayed. When I got home that night, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, like a man who had reinforced the beams of an old house before the storm arrived. I made tea and sat in the dark, letting the taste ground me. No one noticed anything had changed, and that was exactly the point. I began organizing the rest of the house in the same way. I took inventory of every object that mattered: Helen's jewelry, my coin collection, family photographs. I scanned and encrypted the images. I stored backups in places only I knew. I labeled items not for sentiment, but for clarity. No more gray areas, no room for interpretation. Then I began to pull back. When Michael and Susan came by, I greeted them with the same soft voice. I offered tea, not coffee. I served water in glasses with hairline cracks. I stopped baking. I stopped inviting. I let them make the effort. And each time they did, I observed them more than I listened. I counted the seconds Susan let her hand linger on the back of the couch. I watched Michael study the hallway when he thought I was watching television. I started locking drawers. I added a small camera to the front hallway, concealed behind the bookshelf. It didn't record sound, just movement and presence. But that was enough. I didn't need to hear lies. I just needed to confirm them. One evening, I left my phone on the counter, screen up, with a message draft open. Just a name typed out, just enough to tempt curiosity. When I returned 20 minutes later, the screen had gone dark, but the message was no longer where I left it. Someone had exited the app. I checked the camera footage later. Susan had been alone in the kitchen, just long enough. Michael once tried to fix the lock on the back gate, said he noticed it was sticking. I told him not to worry about it, that I liked it that way. It was true. I wanted to hear the squeak. I wanted the sound of entry and exit to be unmistakable. I stopped leaving the house empty when I left. I started leaving the television on, lights in different rooms. I made it unclear when I was gone and when I was simply watching from another angle. I wanted them to feel unsure, to question what was visible and what was not. Still I smiled. Still I nodded. I became an old man again in their presence, harmless, slow, distracted. I forgot things selectively. I misplaced small items. I asked Susan to help me with the thermostat, just once, to watch her fingers find the settings faster than someone unfamiliar should. She was comfortable in the house. Too comfortable. I began to write notes to myself in code, not for security, but for rhythm. I wanted to build the habit of concealment into every part of my day. I labeled files under the names of old tools. Helen's jewelry inventory went under Chisel 4. My revised will was stored under plane handle. No one would look there. No one would guess. Then came the final step. I called John. I asked him to visit, just the two of us. He came on a Sunday. We sat on the porch and watched the wind move through the trees. I didn't tell him what I knew. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. But I told him the history of the house, how I had built it, why I had chosen every detail. I reminded him of the tire swing, the Christmas lights, the sound of his mother laughing from the kitchen window. He listened quietly. He looked away once or twice, but I saw the weight in his eyes. I told him the house was going to be his, but only if he wanted it, only if he chose it. He asked me what I meant. I told him some things don't belong to those who reach for them. They belong to those who remember. He nodded, not fully understanding. Not yet. But he would, because my silence was no longer a retreat. It was a message, and it was almost ready to be read. There's a moment when something you've quietly suspected becomes undeniable. Not a theory, not a feeling, but a fact so clear and sharp that it cuts into you before you even realize it. That moment came on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind that made the sky sit low and gray over the house like a heavy lid. I had just returned from the store. Bread, milk, batteries, small things that old men buy when they don't want to stay home. I stepped through the front door slowly, as I always did, holding the paper bag in one arm, umbrella still dripping from the other. The house was not empty. I could hear the low hum of voices before I even closed the door behind me. The sound came not from the kitchen or the hallway, but from the living room, the same living room where I had begun to feel like a ghost in my own skin. I walked with care, each step measured, the soles of my shoes wet against the wood. I didn't call out. I didn't announce myself. The voices were too close, too soft, too familiar. I stopped just before the entryway and waited. The air felt thick with something unspoken. I could hear Susan's voice first. Her tone was lower than usual, more private, not performative, not polite. And then I heard Michael. His voice was quieter, more intimate than I'd ever heard it. He wasn't telling a story. He wasn't reminiscing. He was murmuring. They were close. Too close. Close enough that I could hear the shape of affection in their silences. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stood there, the bag of groceries still in my arms, my body cold despite the damp heat clinging to my clothes. There was a pause in their voices, and then I heard the sound that changed everything. Not words, not footsteps, but the faint, unmistakable shift of fabric, the sound of one body leaning into another, the creak of the couch as weight shifted in tandem. Not a goodbye hug, not a friendly nudge, an embrace, a closeness that had no place in that room. Not with him, not with her. I backed away before they could see me. My steps were slow, methodical, my hands steady even as my chest trembled beneath my shirt. I placed the grocery bag on the kitchen counter without a sound, the milk sweating cold against the paper. I stood there for a long time, staring out the window at the blurred garden beyond. The flowers I'd planted in spring bent under the weight of the rain. They didn't break, but they bent. I heard them move through the hallway a few minutes later, heard the door close as Susan left. Michael lingered a bit longer, maybe fixing his collar, maybe wiping guilt off his face. When he finally walked out, he didn't stop by the kitchen. He didn't call out. He just walked through the door and down the steps like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Later that evening, I sat in the living room alone. I didn't turn on the lights. I let the gray light of dusk creep in through the windows, casting long, soft shadows across the furniture. I looked at the couch, the same couch that had once held birthday presents and afternoon naps and conversations about college and mortgages and baby names. It now held something else, a memory I didn't want but couldn't shake. I had built this house, with my own hands, with my own breath. Every board, every nail, every seam carried the weight of my life. And in that house, they had desecrated something. Not a rule, not a law, but a bond. A boundary they crossed without hesitation, as if I no longer counted, as if I were already gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen, the clock ticking loud in the quiet, the hum of the refrigerator punctuating the silence. I thought of John, my son. I thought of what he would feel if he knew. I thought of how long it would take for him to realize he was being replaced in pieces, in whispers, in gestures. That while he worked, while he dreamed of raising a family, the people closest to him were unraveling the very thread he clung to. But it wasn't just John who had been betrayed. It was me. Michael had done this before, not in the same way, not with the same cruelty, but the pattern was there. When we were children, he had taken what wasn't his with a grin and never looked back. Now, as an old man, he had found something new to covet, something softer, more dangerous. And Susan, with all her charm and polish and carefully placed hands, had let it happen. They hadn't kissed in front of me. They hadn't made declarations. But they didn't have to. They had stolen something far worse than a moment. They had stolen the silence of trust. And once that silence is gone, it can't be rebuilt. In the days that followed, I spoke less. I moved slower, not from age, but from control. Every gesture I made became deliberate. I watched Susan more carefully. I studied the way she opened drawers, the way she lingered at the window when Michael wasn't around. I noticed when she wore perfume, and when she didn't. I noticed which shoes she chose, how often she came when John was away. Michael didn't try to hide it. He had always believed he was smarter than those around him, that if he smiled enough, people would forget what he'd done, that if he kept his voice smooth, no one would hear the jagged edge beneath it. But I had heard it all. I began to write again, not letters, but records, observations, dates, times, nothing dramatic, just facts. Because one day, facts would matter more than feelings. One day, someone would ask what happened, and I would have the truth lined up like nails in a row. They thought they could do this in my house. They thought I was too old, too tired, too blind. But I wasn't blind. I had simply chosen, until now, to keep my eyes closed. Now, they were open, and I would never close them again. The truth didn't come out in a storm. It didn't crash through the walls or arrive with raised voices and shattered plates. It came quietly, like most tragedies do, in the space between questions that are never asked and answers that arrive too late. It came the way a house settles when no one's watching, board by board, nail by nail, until one day the foundation sinks and you realize it's been happening for years. John arrived on a Sunday. He parked his car in the same crooked angle he always did, wheels kissing the grass, door left slightly ajar. He walked into the house with a strange energy, rushed, distracted, like a man who had left something unfinished behind him. I was sitting in the kitchen with a newspaper I wasn't reading, watching the way the morning light filtered through the blinds. I knew something had changed before he said a word. He sat down across from me, didn't ask for coffee, didn't mention the weather. He placed his phone on the table face down, something he never did, and looked at me like I held an answer he hadn't yet figured out how to ask for. His eyes were darker that day, not tired, not angry, just dimmed, like someone had drawn the curtains behind them. He didn't say Susan's name, not once, but he didn't have to. He talked in circles for a while, about work, about how late she'd been staying at the office, about her distance, her laughter at things that weren't funny, her silences that weren't peaceful. He mentioned Michael briefly, as if tossing a bone into a corner of the room, said he'd been around more, said Susan seemed to enjoy the visits, said he wasn't sure how he felt about it. I watched him closely. Watched the way he tapped his fingers against the edge of the table, the way his leg bounced beneath it, the way his shoulders curled inward slightly, like someone bracing for an impact that hadn't yet arrived, but already left a bruise. He asked me if I thought people could change. I told him they could, but not always for the better. He nodded slowly, like he already knew the answer and just needed to hear it out loud. He didn't ask if I'd noticed anything. He didn't want confirmation. He wanted relief, and I didn't have any to give. That was the beginning. The unraveling came quickly after that. Over the following weeks, John's visits became less frequent. When he did come, he looked thinner, quieter, like a man peeling away from his own skin. His laugh sounded hollow. His eyes avoided mine. He spoke with hesitation, as if unsure whether words could still be trusted. He asked fewer questions and gave fewer answers. I offered him food he didn't eat. I made coffee he let grow cold. He started staying late at work. Or so he said. I knew better. I knew that late at work meant driving around town with no destination, sitting in empty parking lots, watching other people's windows glow with lives he no longer recognized. One evening, he called me from his car. He didn't say much, just that he was outside. I opened the door and found him standing there, his hands deep in his pockets, his coat soaked from the rain. He looked like a boy again, lost, unsure, desperate for someone to make the world small and simple again. He sat on the couch, the same couch I could no longer look at without feeling the weight of betrayal, and stared at the floor. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just told me the truth in fragments, as if each word hurt more than the last. He had found a message, a short one, on Susan's phone, from Michael. It wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. The familiarity in it was enough. The kind of message that can only exist between two people who have crossed a line and never looked back. He confronted her. She denied it. He showed her the message. She called it a joke. He asked for the whole truth. She gave him silence. Silence always tells more than words. I listened without speaking. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't catch. I had known. I had known for weeks, maybe months. But hearing it from him, hearing the weight of his voice collapse under the reality of it, still struck something in me that hadn't moved in years. He asked me what he was supposed to do, how to fix something that was already broken before he realized it had cracked. I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because I knew that answers from a father don't always fit into the world of a son. He stayed the night, curled up on the guest room bed that still held the scent of old linens and quiet memories. In the morning, he left before sunrise. I watched his car drive away through the front window, the sky just beginning to bloom with pale gray. After that, I didn't see him for some time. He stopped answering calls. He stopped replying to messages. I knew he was pulling inward, trying to rebuild himself with pieces that no longer fit. I knew that kind of retreat. I had done it myself once, long ago, when Helen had almost left me. Not for another man, but for a version of herself she no longer recognized. It had taken years to climb back from that distance. But John didn't have years. He came back eventually. He stood on the porch one afternoon, looking 10 years older, wearing clothes that didn't quite sit right on his body. He looked like a man who had lived through a fire no one else could see. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, everything fell away. The house, the years, the blood between us. He was my son again, not the man I hoped he'd become, not the child I'd once lifted above my shoulders, just a man who had been betrayed by people he trusted most. We didn't speak much that day. He walked through the house like it was a museum of choices he no longer understood. He sat at the table. He stared out the window. He asked about the garden, about the tools, about the birds that nested on the back fence. I told him they still came every spring, that they always knew where to return. He didn't respond, but I saw something shift in his expression. A small breath, a small release, like maybe, just maybe, the roots he thought were gone had only grown deeper in his absence. I didn't ask about Susan. I didn't ask about Michael. I didn't need to. What had been taken couldn't be replaced, but I could offer him something else. Not advice, not wisdom, just the quiet knowledge that in this house, even after the collapse, something still stood. And he could stand in it, too. After John's visit, the house changed again. Not in its structure. The walls didn't shift. The floorboards didn't realign. The windows didn't shrink under the weight of what they had seen. No, it was something subtler than that. The silence itself had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It wasn't cold or cruel. It was watchful. It held the weight of everything we had all failed to say out loud. For days I walked through that house, as if it were a memory made solid. Every corner whispered something old. Every item carried a question that no longer needed an answer. The place felt neither abandoned nor alive. It breathed in long, steady rhythms, like an old man sleeping in a chair, aware of everything, but choosing stillness. The living room was the first room to feel it. That couch, which had once felt like a trap door beneath my son's marriage, now stood untouched. The cushions, still slightly misshapen from use, had begun to rise back into place, as if reclaiming their original form. The scent of perfume that had once lingered in the air had vanished, replaced once again by the dull warmth of aged upholstery and dust caught in morning sunbeams. I didn't sit in my chair. I stood beside it. I touched the armrest once and let my hand rest there, as if to say, I remember. The kitchen was quieter than usual, though not unfamiliar. I boiled water the way I always did. I sliced bread without rushing. I ate, standing near the sink. The chair at the table where Susan once perched remained tucked in. No one had sat there in weeks. I didn't move it. I let it stay as it was, as if moving it would shift the balance of the room too violently. I noticed the way the walls held sound again. They echoed slightly now, like they were unsure what to do with the silence that had returned. I found myself whispering without realizing it. Short sentences, half-formed thoughts, but there was no one there to answer. And that was fine. That was better. I spent hours walking the length of the hallway from my bedroom to the front door. There was a rhythm in it I had never noticed before, a subtle conversation between the floorboards and my weight. Each creak was familiar, each step answered by the next. That hallway had seen more of me than most people in my life ever had. It knew my pace, my posture, my hesitation. It remembered the nights I paced with a sick child in my arms, the mornings I walked with a cup of coffee as the sun rose, the quiet afternoons when I stood there listening to voices from another room, voices that didn't belong to me. Now it was just my steps again. In the evenings, I sat by the window and watched the street. The neighbor's dog barked at passing cars. The mail arrived later each day. The wind moved through the maple trees with the same tired grace as always. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nothing had burned or collapsed. No police sirens had split the air. But a reckoning had passed through this house just the same. And it had left behind something cleaner. Not forgiveness, not healing. Just space. I started opening windows more often, letting the air move through the rooms, lifting curtains that hadn't swayed in months. I let the breeze touch photographs that hung on the walls. Let the scent of earth and pollen and distant firewood remind me that the world outside kept going, even when everything inside felt paused. I found comfort in the way dust danced in the light, its patterns unpredictable but always beautiful. Even the dust had learned to live with silence. Michael hadn't returned. His absence was louder than any door slam. I checked my messages once or twice out of habit. But there was nothing. No call, no apology, no explanation. And yet, it wasn't absence I felt. It was distance. A necessary, overdue distance. The kind that doesn't sting. The kind that settles into your bones like the calm after a long storm. I didn't talk to Susan again. I imagined she told herself a story about what had happened. People like her always did. I imagined she had already rearranged the facts in her head until they fit neatly into a version where she was misunderstood, maybe even wounded. I let her have it. That version of reality belonged to her now. The house no longer held space for her revision. John returned slowly, not physically, but in pieces. I'd find notes on the porch sometimes, short ones. Stopped by, saw the flowers, looks good. Or borrowed the wrench, will return soon. He wasn't ready to sit at the table again, but he was circling the perimeter, like a child testing the ice. I didn't push. I didn't call. I just left the porch light on. One day, I found one of his old baseballs in the shed. The stitches were frayed, the leather scuffed beyond recognition. I held it in my hand and remembered the arc of it flying through the air in the backyard, his voice chasing after it, my hand always just a little too slow. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood there holding time. The silence of the house had turned into something else now. It wasn't the silence of betrayal anymore. It wasn't a silence filled with suspicion or weight. It was a waiting silence. A gentle kind. The kind that exists between chapters, not at the end of a book. The kind of silence that invites, not demands, what comes next. The radio played soft jazz again. The television stayed off. The newspapers stacked slowly in the corner. The crossword puzzles half finished and folded neatly. I moved through each day without fanfare. I did the dishes. I watered the plants. I opened drawers slowly and closed them even slower. This house, once filled with echoes of voices that didn't belong, had finally found its breath again. It belonged to me now, and I belonged to it. No one else. Not anymore. There came a day when I realized the most powerful things I had left were my name and my decisions. Not the ones I had made in the past, but the ones I still had control over. The ones I could sign. The ones I could file. The ones that could not be undone by charm or manipulation or proximity. It wasn't bitterness that led me to open the files again. It was clarity. A deep, bone-level understanding that if I didn't put my life into writing, someone else would put it into motion. And it wouldn't be a version I recognized. The folder sat in the top drawer of my bedroom dresser. It had a small brass tab and smelled faintly of cedar and paper glue. I had kept everything organized for years. Tax returns, deeds, insurance policies, the original loan paperwork from the mortgage I'd paid off more than a decade earlier. But this time, I didn't just skim. I didn't just check dates or signatures. I went through every page as if I had never seen them before. I read each sentence aloud in my mind, listening to the sound of my own legacy. The first thing I rewrote was my will. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. I didn't want to punish. I wanted to protect. And there's a difference. The old version had been too simple. A standard form, signed during a year when everything felt predictable. A house to John. Savings split evenly. Personal items left to whomever was still around. That was back when I thought family could be trusted to honor memory. Back when I believed blood meant something more than just shared features. I went to my lawyer's office the next morning. A quiet building with high windows and no music in the lobby. The kind of place where words don't echo because they're already heavy. I sat with a man named Hughes. He had gray hair, dry hands, and a way of speaking that was slow, but surgical. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer condolences or commentary. He simply placed the documents in front of me and waited. I revised every line. The house would remain in my possession until death, but with a restriction clause, No early transfer, no proxy management, no assumption of title without direct confirmation. It would go to John only if he accepted it alone, unattached to anyone else, and only if he chose to live in it rather than sell. If he refused, or if the conditions weren't met, the house would go to the local Veterans Housing Trust. I wanted it to be lived in, not liquidated. The savings accounts were divided differently now. I created a trust, overseen by a third-party fiduciary, with specific disbursement rules. No lump sums, no early withdrawals, no access through marriage. A portion was designated for John's future, in stages. Another for my funeral expenses. The rest I earmarked for things I believed in, quietly, without announcing it. A shelter in town, a library, a scholarship fund for tradesmen. Personal items were categorized by meaning, not by value. My coin collection, the same one that began with a stolen piece of silver in childhood, would go to the Historical Society. Not for its worth, but for its story. The letters Helen had written me, kept in a small cedar box beneath the bed, would be sealed and sent to John when I died. Not before. I didn't want them twisted by present grief. I wanted them to reach him after the dust had settled. I removed names. That was the hardest part. Not the legal act of doing it, but the finality of it. I had to write Susan's name to cross it out. I had to see it there, typed in black ink, formal and fixed, before I could declare it null. And Michael, his name had never been in the will, but I checked every corner of every document, just to be certain. He had no place in my paperwork. That mattered to me. When I signed the new version, I paused for a moment, not out of doubt, out of stillness, out of recognition that this signature meant more than any I had placed on a work order or a check or a birthday card. This was the record of what I had chosen to carry forward. This was the evidence that I had not disappeared, that I had not been erased. I returned home with copies in a sealed envelope. I placed them in the safe behind the bookshelf, one of those details no one but me would know. I kept a backup in the garage, inside a rusted toolbox marked Old Screws. No one ever looked there. And I informed the lawyer, in writing, that no changes could be made without my physical presence and voice. My final words would not come from anyone else's mouth. After that, the house felt different again. I began to move through it with new ownership, not just the legal kind, but the emotional kind, the kind that comes from defending something not with arguments, but with forethought. I cleaned out drawers. I donated clothes. I rearranged the books in the living room, not because I was preparing to leave, but because I was preparing to stay, on my terms. The hallway, once filled with tension, became a passage again. The kitchen, no longer carrying the smell of someone else's perfume, returned to the scent of black coffee and lemon oil. The living room regained its balance. I opened the windows wider. I polished the floorboards. I re-oiled the hinges on the cabinet doors. And I wrote. Not legal documents, not instructions, but thoughts, memories, reflections, on small pieces of paper, tucked into books, placed behind framed photographs, folded into envelopes and hidden inside toolboxes. Words I wanted found one day, not because they revealed secrets, but because they whispered truths, the kind that only carry weight when read in solitude. I didn't know if John would ever understand the full scope of what I had done. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because someone had to draw the line. Someone had to say, "This far? No further." Someone had to reclaim the silence and make it mean something more than absence. These rewritten pages weren't revenge. They were restoration, of dignity, of order, of myself. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic reveal, no slam of doors or raised voices echoing down the hallways of my house. That wasn't the shape of what happened. In the end, what unfolded was quieter than all that. So quiet it might have been mistaken for nothing at all. But it wasn't nothing. It was a clean shift in the weight of things, It was the moment when stillness stopped meaning paralysis and started meaning control. Michael stopped coming by. He didn't call to explain. He didn't leave a note or send an apology dressed up as casual conversation. He simply disappeared the way only a man like him could, slowly at first, then all at once. His car no longer pulled into my driveway with its overconfident hum. His voice no longer filtered in from the porch. The seat he favored in the living room remained untouched for weeks until I moved it to the corner without thinking, the indent in the cushion rising back into shape like nothing had ever happened. I imagined that he knew, or at least sensed, that the current had shifted beneath his feet, that whatever unspoken permission he believed he'd been granted had been quietly revoked. I hadn't told him to leave. I hadn't changed my tone or declared my awareness. I had simply closed the door in my own way, without ever touching the knob. Susan didn't come back either. Not alone. Not with John. Not at all. Her absence was more noticeable at first, because it arrived in the form of silence, where she had once filled rooms with suggestion. The kitchen no longer carried her scent. The cushions no longer bore the outline of her movements. Her presence had always arrived like a guest overstaying their welcome without ever acknowledging it. Now, without her, the house settled again. The floors stopped whispering behind my back. The mirrors no longer reflected anything foreign. John came back slowly, as I had hoped, not with ceremony, not with explanations, but with presence. He began to stop by on his own, on random days, unannounced, but never unwelcome. He never asked about them. I never offered anything. We didn't speak about what had broken. Instead, we picked up things from the corners where they had been quietly set down and forgotten. He repaired a loose shutter on the back of the house one morning without being asked. Another day, he brought coffee and sat with me in the garden for an hour, both of us watching the birds fuss over the feeder like nothing in the world had ever fallen apart. I started to see his hands move like mine used to, with purpose, not noise, with care, not rush. Something had cracked in him, yes, but something else had also taken root, something steadier, more deliberate, as if the betrayal had stripped away illusions and left behind only what was necessary. One afternoon, he brought over an old photo album I thought was lost. Inside were pictures of him as a child, covered in mud and sunlight, and Helen, with her wild hair and steady smile. We looked at the images without commentary, letting memory breathe in the space between us. When he left that day, he hugged me, not stiffly, not as obligation, just once, with both arms. It was enough. In the quiet that followed, I realized I had finally taken the house back, not just legally, not just structurally, but spiritually. Each room had been cleansed, not with fire or fury, but with time and patience, with steps taken softly, with decisions made in private. The weight that had once pressed down on me every time I crossed the threshold had lifted. The air was different. The silence no longer accused. It exhaled. I slept more soundly than I had in years. I woke with purpose, even if that purpose was simple. A walk around the block, a repair in the shed, a new loaf of bread in the oven. The rhythms returned not as repetition, but as choice. I chose them. I owned them. Sometimes I'd sit by the window at dusk, watching the shadows stretch across the lawn, and think about how many stories had passed through this place. Some loud, some shameful, some healing. But in the end, mine was the one that remained. Not because I fought harder, but because I waited, because I listened, because I acted when no one thought I was watching, and because I had never truly left myself behind. The house became mine again, fully and quietly. My tools remained where I had placed them. My photographs hung where I had nailed them. The floor creaked in the exact same way, but it no longer unsettled me. It sounded like an old friend clearing its throat in another room. Victory, I discovered, doesn't always roar. It doesn't always arrive in the form of vindication or applause. Sometimes it arrives in the way a man stands in his own hallway, knowing that every inch of it is his again. In the way a door closes without a sound and stays closed. In the way a son returns, not because he is asked, but because he wants to. My brother had always thought the loudest voice in the room won the argument. Susan had believed control could be maintained through presence alone. But I had chosen silence, and silence had outlasted them both.